Okay, so you think you've got a handle on the news today, right? And then something like this just drops.
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive today into something that could really reshape, U.S. education, like really fundamentally.
For sure.
President Trump's expected executive order.
Yeah.
The one aiming to start dismantling the Department of Education.
It's definitely gotten everyone talking, that's for sure. And it brings up some really, really basic questions about how we as a country think about education policy and, at what role the federal government should even have.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got a whole bunch of different perspectives lined up. News reports, obviously, covering the immediate actions. And this really interesting piece by William J. Bennett and Lamar Alexander,
Right.
both former U.S. Secretaries of Education.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our goal today is to really get into the nuts and bolts of this executive order.
Yeah.
Figure out what it actually does, what it sets in motion, and then explore, what could happen because of it for education in the future. And, try to understand the immediate reactions and also what the long-term picture might be.
Totally.
One thing that is really important that we saw in all our sources is this.
Yeah.
An executive order can't just make the Department of Education disappear poof, it's gone.
It would be nice.
That would take an act of Congress.
Uh-huh.
It's more like the starting pistol,
Right.
not the finish line.
Yeah, that's a super important point to remember. It shows the administration's intention, the direction they want to go.
Right.
It can get some administrative changes going, within the existing system. But to get rid of a whole cabinet-level department, they need Congress to act.
Okay, so let's get into the real substance of this executive order and what the Trump administration is thinking, behind it.
Yeah.
Reports are saying that President Trump is probably going to sign this thing today, March 20th, 2025. And the goal they're saying is to start the process of dismantling and eventually shutting down the Department of Education. Their main argument is all about giving control of education back to each state.
Okay.
They're saying that the current federal system is bloated and stuck in regulations and paperwork, and that it's not doing what it should for American students. They even said something like, why would we keep doing the same thing over and over and expect different results?
Yeah. I saw it.
It's a pretty direct challenge to how we're doing things now.
Yeah. What's interesting here is the philosophy behind it, right? This whole idea of subsidiarity. The idea that decisions should be made at the most local level possible, you know?
Right.
They're saying that states understand their students and communities better.
Right.
And can make better education programs that actually fit.
Yeah.
Instead of a one-size-fits-all federal thing.
Right. So the executive order is coming, and we get why the administration wants to do it.
Yeah.
But like we said, the legal and political side of things is huge.
For sure.
An executive order isn't the end of the story to really get rid of the Department of Education. Congress has to pass a law.
Yeah. Former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has weighed in on this. He thinks there will be lawsuits and that the courts will decide if all this is even legal.
Interesting.
He also mentioned that this could save the government money, but he didn't say outright that he supports getting rid of the whole department.
I see. So he's being cautious.
Yeah. Sounds like he knows there are big obstacles both legally and in Congress.
Yeah.
Given how cautious he is, what legal challenges do you think are most likely to come up?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I think people will argue whether the president can even change how a department that Congress created works, without them saying it's okay.
Right.
They might say he's overstepping his power and taking power away from Congress.
Right.
The courts would have to look at the actual laws that created the Department of Education and see if the executive order goes too far.
Right.
Is he exceeding his authority to change or reorganize government agencies?
Well, it's a real separation of powers issue at its core.
Exactly. Now, as you can imagine, this news hasn't made everyone happy. Senator Elizabeth Warren came out really strongly against this expected order. She called it a code red.
Wow.
For every public school student, parent, and teacher in the country.
That's strong.
Yeah, strong as it gets. She thinks this means President Trump doesn't care about the well-being or future of public school kids. And she's predicting some pretty bad things for working families, students, and teachers, like cuts to after-school programs, bigger class sizes, less financial aid.
Right.
But she thinks the billionaires will be fine. What's happened in the past when federal money or oversight for education has been cut.
Well, historically when that's happened, sometimes it's meant that richer school districts have more resources than poorer ones.
Right.
And a lot of federal programs focus on specific needs, right? Like helping low-income students with disabilities and English language learners. So if there isn't specific federal money and people checking up on things, there's a risk that those vulnerable students won't get the help and services they need, and that could make the achievement gap even worse.
Right.
Plus, federal civil rights laws have been really important in making sure all students have equal access to education.
Yeah.
And if the federal government isn't as involved, those protections might not be enforced as well.
That's a worrying thought now, for a completely different take on this.
Yeah.
We have this opinion piece by William J. Bennett and Lamar Alexander. Remember, both former U.S. Secretaries of Education.
Right.
They make this really interesting point. The U.S. was around for 200 years before we had a federal Department of Education. And they think we could go back to that. They're saying that in the 45 years the department has existed, it hasn't really made things better for students overall.
Right.
And it's just led to more government spending in education.
Interesting.
It's a pretty direct challenge to the idea that we need a federal department for good education in the country.
It really makes you think about what we just assume about needing federal structures. They're basically saying, look at the data. Has the Department of Education actually fixed the problems with American education?
Right.
Maybe it's not about who's in charge at the federal level, but how well the policies and programs are actually working.
Right.
And, they were in charge of the department, so they know what they're talking about.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They say that even though the department might not be necessary in its current form, there are 3 really important things that it does that shouldn't be eliminated.
Okay, I'm listening.
The first one is the nation's report card.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us more about that and why they think it's so important, even if the department goes away?
Sure. So the nation's report card is actually called the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
Okay.
And it's basically a big test that gives us data on how students across the country are doing in different subjects.
Right.
This happens over time so we can see trends. It's run by the National Center for Education Statistics.
Got it.
And Bennett and Alexander think this is super important for understanding how well American education is doing overall.
Yeah.
They point out that Congress first said we needed to collect this kind of national data way back in 1867.
Wow.
Their point is we need this information gathered regularly, analyzed carefully, and reported accurately.
That makes sense.
Without it, we don't have a way to see how our students are doing on a national level.
Right.
And whether our education policies are actually working. It's like trying to drive without a map.
So even if the department changes a lot, they're saying this national data collection has to stay.
Absolutely.
What's the second thing they think is crucial?
The second big thing is addressing violations of student civil rights.
Okay.
This is a big area, like making sure students with disabilities get the help they need,
Right.
protecting minority students from discrimination, and dealing with harassment and bullying.
Mm-hmm.
They say the Department of Education is really important for investigating and fixing these problems. Yeah.
So that all students have a fair chance and a safe place to learn.
Makes sense.
They know the Justice Department is also involved in civil rights.
Right.
But they point out that the Justice Department has a ton of work already.
Yeah.
So the Education Department is really important for focusing on these issues, specifically in schools.
So it's not just about how well students do academically, but about making sure things are fair for every student.
Exactly.
And their point about the Education Department's specific focus on these issues within schools is important.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the third thing they think is essential?
The third thing is how the federal government gives money to schools and colleges across the country.
Okay.
Now, they do say that this needs some work.
Uh-huh.
They think we need to change how we decide who gets what.
Right.
They actually suggest giving most of the K-12 money to states as block grants.
Okay.
So states would have more freedom to decide how to use the money,
Right.
but they really like the Pell Grant program for college.
Mm-hmm. They think it's a good model for financial aid that helps students directly and should definitely continue.
So they want changes, but they still think it's really important for the federal government to give money to support education.
Exactly.
So if I'm getting this right, they're open to not having a Department of Education, but they think these 3 things are essential. Yeah. Collecting data with the nation's report card, protecting student civil rights, and giving federal money to education.
Right.
And these things need to be kept no matter what happens to the department. It's interesting to hear that from people who actually ran the department, you know?
It is. It shows that this isn't a simple question of whether to have the department or not.
Right.
It's a bigger discussion about what's really important for making sure education is good and fair for everyone in the country.
And how we can make sure that happens.
Exactly.
Now, our sources also mentioned a couple of other things going on at the same time.
Okay.
The Justice Department had a deadline about deportation flights and all the controversy around that.
Right.
And Representative Ocasio-Cortez is joining Senator Sanders for his Fighting Oligarchy tour in Arizona and Nevada. These aren't directly about the Department of Education.
Right.
But they show what's happening in politics right now while all this is going on with education.
Yeah, it shows how much is happening at the same time.
Right, and how everything's connected.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of the bigger picture.
Okay, so to bring it all together, it seems like the immediate effect of this executive order will be mostly political and legal. People are already reacting strongly, and Mitch McConnell thinks there will be lawsuits.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is going to be a long process with lots of debate.
For sure, the long-term effects depend on what Congress does.
Right.
This executive order is just the beginning.
And the big question is whether the administration's goal of giving states more power over education will actually make things better, or if it will weaken national standards, make the differences between states and schools worse.
Right.
And maybe even lead to losing those essential national functions that even some people who want to get rid of the department think are really important.
That's the core issue, right? It's about the balance between federal and state power.
Right.
Especially when it comes to something as important as education.
And, you know, this could affect you even if you don't have kids in school or work in education.
That's right.
How education is run, how it's paid for, and how we measure its success affects everyone.
Absolutely. It affects the future workforce, the economy, and our society as a whole.
So to recap what we talked about today.
Yeah.
President Trump's executive order to start dismantling the Department of Education. The fact that Congress has to act to actually get rid of it. The different opinions about what might happen, and those really important functions within the department, like the nation's report card. And enforcing civil rights.
Right. And we talked about the administration's argument for giving states more power and reducing bureaucracy.
Right.
And the concerns about keeping national standards and making sure things are fair. And making sure we keep doing important things like collecting data and monitoring civil rights.
Okay, so here's something to think about. The U.S. was around for 200 years without a Department of Education.
Right.
What parts of the current system do you think are really necessary to make sure all students get a good and fair education?
It's a good question.
And how could we keep those essential things if the Department of Education is dismantled or changed a lot in the next few years?
Yeah, that's something we'll all be watching closely.
It's a complicated question, and it's one that's going to be important for a long time.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.